Welcome to Calm Mysteries, a quiet place where forgotten history, lost kingdoms, and unsolved secrets drift softly through time. There is nothing you need to solve, nothing you need to remember. Just listen, relax, and let the past carry you gently into sleep. The night the palace went silent, the candles in the Hall of Mirrors burned lower as dawn approached on the first day of September in the year 1715, their flames casting trembling shadows across walls that had witnessed 72 years of absolute power. In the heart of Versailles, where 10,000 people lived and breathed within gilded walls, an unusual stillness had begun to settle like morning mist across the gardens. The courtiers, who normally rushed through corridors with urgent messages and whispered intrigues, moved differently now, their silk shoes making softer sounds against marble floors, their voices dropping to murmurs that barely disturbed the air. You would have noticed it first in the small things. The musicians who usually assembled in the gallery at dawn had not appeared. The valets who typically began their elaborate morning routines in the antechambers stood frozen in doorways, uncertain whether protocol still mattered when the man who had created every protocol lay dying in his bedchamber. Outside, in the sprawling gardens where André Le Nôtre had spent 40 years perfecting geometric perfection, the fountains continued their programmed displays, but no one stood to watch them. The water rose and fell in precisely calculated arcs, indifferent to the drama unfolding in the rooms above. In the king's bedchamber, Louis XIV lay surrounded by physicians, who had long since exhausted their considerable repertoire of treatments. For more than 2 weeks, they had watched gangrene spread from his left foot upward, blackening flesh that had once danced through the most elaborate ballets Europe had ever witnessed. The king who had proclaimed himself the Sun King, who'd built this impossible palace from his father's modest hunting lodge, who had ruled France for longer than most of his subjects had been alive, was dying in the same room where he had held court every morning for decades. The room itself seemed to hold its breath. Heavy velvet curtains, replaced every season regardless of their condition, hung motionless in air that had grown thick with the smell of decay and desperate medicine. Priests moved in and out, their robes whispering prayers that blended with the labored breathing of the dying monarch. Cardinals and bishops had been summoning their courage for days, preparing for the moment when they would need to guide France's most powerful soul toward whatever judgment awaited him. Cardinal de Rohan stood nearest the bed, his fingers working through prayer beads that had belonged to 3 generations of his family. He had known this king for 57 years, had watched him transform from a young man who danced and hunted with boundless energy into this withered figure whose leg had turned black with death. The cardinal remembered the king in his glory years, when he would rise before dawn to hunt in the forests surrounding Versailles, returning muddy and exhilarated to bathe and dress for the day's audiences. Now those same forests stood silent beyond the windows, their trees wearing the first hints of autumn colour. The physicians had tried everything their science offered. They had bled him repeatedly, convinced that removing bad blood would somehow restore balance to his humours. They had applied poultices made from ingredients that ranged from the mundane to the exotic, compounds purchased at enormous expense from apothecaries who claimed secret knowledge passed down from ancient Egypt or distant China. They had even attempted the most radical treatment their era knew, amputating the gangrenous limb, but the king had refused this final indignity. He would die whole, he had declared, even if that wholeness included rotting flesh. Around the palace, the machinery of court life continued its motions, but the rhythm had changed fundamentally. In the kitchens below, cooks still prepared elaborate meals according to schedules established decades earlier, but the food went largely uneaten. Servants carried trays through corridors, where nobles no longer gathered to gossip and scheme. The king's supper, prepared every evening with the same attention to detail that had marked 50 years of royal dining, sat untouched on golden plates, while he drifted in and out of consciousness in the room above. The Duchess of Ventadour, who had served at court since 1703, remembered when these same corridors had thrummed with constant activity. She recalled the days when the king would emerge from his apartments at precisely the same hour each morning, when hundreds of courtiers would scramble for position to witness him perform the simple act of getting dressed. The lever du roi, the rising of the king, had been the most important event in France for longer than most people could remember. Now, the king rose only in his bed, struggling to breathe, fighting against death with the same determination he had once brought to expanding France's borders. In the antechambers, nobles who had built their entire lives around proximity to the king found themselves adrift. The Duke of Saint-Simon, that meticulous chronicler of court life, who would later spend decades writing about these very days, moved through rooms where he had witnessed countless dramas. He noted everything with the careful eye of someone who understood that history was being made in these quiet hours. The way the light fell differently without the king's presence to animate it, the manner in which courtiers who had competed ferociously for the king's attention now competed to demonstrate the most convincing grief. The palace that Louis had spent decades perfecting stood as a monument to his vision of absolute monarchy, made manifest in architecture. Every room, every corridor, every garden path had been designed to reinforce a simple message. The king was the center of France, and France was the center of the world. Versailles itself was an argument made in marble and gold, a three-dimensional assertion that one man could impose his will on nature, on society, on reality itself. Now, as that man lay dying, the argument seemed to falter. Outside the bedchamber, the king's great-grandson and heir, Louis XV, who was only 5 years old, played quietly under the watchful eye of his governess. The child understood in some vague way that something momentous was happening, but the full weight of what awaited him remained mercifully beyond his comprehension. He would inherit the most powerful throne in Europe, would take on the burden of ruling 20 million people, would become the focal point of an elaborate court that had spent 72 years organizing itself around one man's vision. But for now, he remained a small boy whose great-grandfather was sick. The king, in his lucid moments, had been trying to prepare his heir. He had called the child to his bedside several times during the past week, offering advice that ranged from the practical to the profound. "Do not love war as I have loved it," he had told the boy. "Do not burden your people with the endless taxation that my ambitions required. Build wisely, but do not bankrupt the treasury as I have done." The advice came late, after decades of exactly the opposite behaviour, but it came from a place of genuine remorse as death approached. In the galleries, portrait after portrait showed the king in his various ages and guises. As a child king, crowned at 4 years old after his father's death. As a young man in elaborate costumes designed for the ballets he loved. As a warrior king, posed dramatically before imagined battlefields, as the Sun King in full regalia, representing the absolute power of French monarchy at its zenith. The painters who had created these images had worked under strict instructions to show the king as he wished to be seen, not necessarily as he was. Now, the real man behind the images lay dying while the painted versions continued to gaze down with eternal confidence. The servants who attended the king in these final days moved with a careful deliberation that came from understanding their unique position in history. They would be the ones who witnessed the end, who would later tell their grandchildren about the night the palace went silent. The valets who had dressed the king every morning for decades now tended to his dying body with the same attention to detail they had always maintained. They adjusted his nightshirt when it twisted. They dabbed at his forehead with cloths soaked in rose water. They maintained the fiction that this was simply another morning, another evening, another day in the endless routine of royal service. Madame de Maintenon, the king's morganatic wife of more than 30 years, had withdrawn to her apartments after her final visit to the bedchamber. She had married Louis secretly in 1683, shortly after the death of Queen Maria Theresa, and had been his constant companion through the declining years of his reign. A woman of remarkable intellect and piety, she had influenced the king toward a more religious outlook in his later years, helping to transform the libertine of his youth into the devout Catholic of his old age. Now, at 80 years old herself, she prayed in her private chapel, preparing for a future she could barely imagine. The king's death would end her position at court. Without him, she would be simply another elderly woman, stripped of the informal power she had wielded for 3 decades. She had already begun making arrangements to retire to Saint-Cyr, the school for impoverished noble girls that she had founded years earlier. There she would spend her remaining days in relative obscurity, teaching and praying, remembered by some as the woman who had tamed a king and forgotten by others as soon as she left Versailles. In the Chapel Royal, where the king had attended Mass every day that his health permitted, priests prepared for the elaborate funeral rites that would mark the end of the longest reign in French history. They rehearsed the ceremonies, checked the supplies of incense and holy oil, ensured that every candle was ready to be lit at the appropriate moment. The funeral would be a spectacle worthy of the man who had made spectacle into an instrument of state power. Every detail would be choreographed, every moment planned to reinforce the continuity of the monarchy, even as one king passed and another took his place. The king had been preparing for this moment in his own way. He had spent recent weeks putting his affairs in order, reviewing his will, making final adjustments to the arrangements he had made for the succession. He had legitimized several of his illegitimate children, elevating them to positions where they could support the young heir who would inherit his throne. He had settled old debts and old grudges, made peace with enemies he would soon leave behind. The man who had spent his life accumulating power now worked to ensure that power would transfer smoothly to the next generation. In the stables, the horses that the king had loved stood in their elaborately appointed stalls, tended by grooms who wondered what would become of them. Louis had maintained hundreds of horses at Versailles, from the magnificent war horses he had ridden in his younger years to the gentle mares he preferred in old age. Each animal had been carefully selected, meticulously trained, housed in accommodations that exceeded the living conditions of most French peasants. The royal stables were themselves a small palace, designed by the same architects who had created the main chateau, decorated with the same attention to detail. The gardens, those impossible gardens that stretched for miles in every direction, continued their carefully programmed beauty, regardless of what happened inside the palace. The flower beds changed with the seasons, according to plans laid out decades in advance. The orange trees, thousands of them in their portable boxes, stood in formation like soldiers awaiting orders. The fountains ran according to schedules that had been refined over 50 years of operation. Nature itself had been bent to the king's will at Versailles, forced into geometric patterns that pleased the eye while denying the organic chaos of untamed growth. André Le Nôtre, who had created these gardens, had died 17 years earlier in 1700, but his vision lived on in every trimmed hedge and calculated sightline. He had understood what the king wanted, a landscape that demonstrated human mastery over nature, that showed the world what absolute power could accomplish when applied with sufficient resources and unwavering determination. The gardens were an argument in topiary and water, a demonstration that a king could reshape reality itself if he willed it. As dawn approached on that first day of September, the candles in the bedchamber had burned down to stubs. Servants moved quietly to replace them, maintaining the continuous light that the king had always preferred. He had lived his entire adult life in illumination, had made light itself into a symbol of his reign. The sun might set on France's enemies, but it would never set on the Sun King himself, except, of course, that it was setting now, dimming as his life force ebbed away. The physicians conferred in whispers at the foot of the bed. They had done everything they knew to do, had applied every treatment their science offered, and still the gangrene advanced. The king's fever rose and fell in waves that left him alternately lucid and delirious. In his clear moments, he spoke with surprising coherence about matters of state, about his regrets, about his hopes for France's future. In his delirium, he returned to earlier times, speaking to people long dead, reliving moments from his 7 decades of life. The courtiers who waited in the outer chambers had begun to divide into factions, already positioning themselves for the coming transition. Some attached themselves to the Duke of Orleans, who would likely serve as regent for the young heir. Others sought favour with the legitimized royal bastards, particularly the Duke of Maine, who had his own ambitions for power. The competition for position that had always characterized Versailles had simply shifted its focus from the dying king to those who would wield power after his death. The servants who brought news from the bedchamber to the waiting courtiers found themselves suddenly important. These men and women, who had been nearly invisible during the king's health, now commanded attention whenever they emerged from the inner sanctum. Every cough, every moment of consciousness, every word the king spoke became vital intelligence for those trying to position themselves for the transition. The servants, many of whom had given their entire lives to royal service, found this new attention both flattering and disturbing. In the king's personal chapel, a small room adjacent to his bedchamber where he had prayed in his final years, a crucifix that had belonged to his mother, Anne of Austria, caught the morning light. The king had been devoted to this particular cross, had held it during moments of crisis, had drawn comfort from its familiar weight. Now it waited on its altar, soon to pass to new hands, to witness new prayers from new lips. The tapestries that lined the bedchamber walls depicted scenes from classical mythology, stories of gods and heroes that the king had always enjoyed. Apollo driving his sun chariot across the sky, Hercules completing his impossible labors, Alexander the Great conquering the known world. These images had been chosen deliberately to associate the king with legendary figures, to suggest that his reign belonged to the same category as these mythic achievements. Now, as the man behind the myth lay dying, the tapestries seemed almost to mock him with their immortal vitality. The clock in the chamber, an elaborate mechanism crafted by the finest horologists in Paris, continued its precise measurement of time. Each tick marked another moment passing, another second closer to the inevitable end. The king had always been punctual, had organized his entire day around the clock, had made time itself bow to his schedule. Now, time refused to bend, continued its inexorable forward movement, regardless of royal preference. Outside, in the town of Versailles that had grown up around the palace, ordinary people went about their morning routines with an awareness that something momentous was happening behind the gilded gates. Merchants opened their shops, bakers fired their ovens, servants who worked in the palace but lived in the town prepared to begin their day shifts. They all knew the king was dying, but life continued its demands regardless. Bread needed to be baked. Shops needed to be opened. Children needed to be fed and sent to whatever approximation of school their families could afford. The king had created this town, had summoned it into existence through the sheer force of his will and his treasury. Before Versailles became a palace, this had been empty farmland, unremarkable countryside between Paris and the western forests. Now it housed tens of thousands of people whose entire lives revolved around serving the palace and its inhabitants. When the king died, would this town continue? Would the next king maintain Versailles as the center of French power, or would the court return to Paris, leaving this elaborate fantasy to slowly decay? Back in the bedchamber, the king stirred as dawnlight began filtering through gaps in the heavy curtains. A valet moved to open them slightly, knowing that the king preferred natural light in the morning. The familiar routine continued even as everything else changed. The king's eyes opened, focused briefly on the ceiling painted with images of divine glory, then closed again. His breathing continued its labored rhythm, each inhalation requiring visible effort, each exhalation seeming to carry away a small portion of his remaining strength. The priests began their morning prayers, their Latin phrases rolling through the room with practiced smoothness. They had been praying almost continuously for days now, taking turns to ensure that holy words constantly surrounded the dying king. The church had its own interests in this transition, its own concerns about what would happen when Louis died. The king had been a defender of Gallicanism, the doctrine that gave the French church considerable independence from Rome. Would his successor maintain this position, or would the papacy finally succeed in bringing France more firmly under its control? Cardinal Fleury, who would later serve as the chief minister to Louis XV, stood among the assembled clergy, already thinking ahead to the challenges facing the kingdom. France was exhausted after decades of nearly continuous warfare. The treasury was depleted, burdened by debts that had accumulated through costly wars and even costlier building projects. The people were overtaxed, resentful, increasingly willing to question the divine right of kings that had been the foundation of French monarchy for centuries. The next reign would inherit all these problems along with the crown. The morning advanced slowly through the palace. each hour marked by the bells in the chapel royal that rang as they had rung for decades, indifferent to the drama playing out in the king's bedchamber. By mid-morning, word had spread throughout Versailles, and beyond that, the end was very near. Courtiers who had left briefly to rest or attend to personal matters hurried back, desperate not to miss the final moments. To be absent when the king died would be to miss the most significant event of their generation, to forfeit their claim to have witnessed history firsthand. The Duke of Saint-Simon, still moving through the palace with his careful observer's eye, noted how differently people reacted to the approaching death. Some wore their grief ostentatiously, weeping loudly in the corridors, making certain everyone saw their devotion to the dying king. Others maintained careful neutrality, unwilling to commit too strongly to any particular emotion until they better understood who would hold power in the coming regime. Still others barely bothered to hide their anticipation, already mentally distributing the positions and privileges that would become available when the old king died and a new order emerged. In the kitchens, the staff prepared the midday meal according to schedules that had governed palace life for as long as anyone could remember. The king's luncheon was prepared with the same attention to detail as always, even though everyone knew he would not eat it. The ritual mattered more than the reality. To stop preparing the king's meals would be to admit he was already dead, to surrender to a future that had not yet officially arrived. So the cooks continued their work, creating dishes that would go uneaten, maintaining routines that had become almost sacred through decades of repetition. The king's confessor, a Jesuit priest who had heard the monarch's sins for the past 12 years, emerged from a final private audience, looking drawn and exhausted. Whatever secrets he had heard would die with him, protected by the seal of confession, but the weight of them showed on his face. To hear the final confession of a king who had ruled for 72 years, to absorb the regrets and acknowledgements of a man who had wielded absolute power over millions of lives, was a burden few men could carry easily. Madame de Maintenon, in her private apartments, received a stream of visitors who came ostensibly to offer comfort, but actually to position themselves for the transition. She met them with the same cool dignity she had maintained throughout her years of informal power, offering no hints about her plans, making no commitments that might be used against her later. She had survived at Versailles by understanding the rules of court politics better than almost anyone, and she would not forget those lessons, even in the face of personal loss. The young Louis XV, the heir who would inherit this impossible burden, had been taken to see his great-grandfather one final time. The child stood at the bedside, held steady by his governess, and looked at the dying king with wide eyes that did not fully comprehend what he was seeing. The old king had tried to speak to him, had attempted some final words of wisdom, but the effort proved too great. Instead, he had simply reached out one trembling hand to touch the boy's head in a gesture of blessing and farewell. The governess had led the child away, back to apartments that would soon be transformed into the centre of a new court. Already, courtiers were beginning to gather there to pay their respects to the future king, to establish early claims on his attention and favour. The boy, mercifully protected by his youth from understanding the full implications of what was happening, returned to his toys and his lessons, his life about to change in ways he could not possibly imagine. In the Hall of Mirrors, that greatest achievement of the palace's architecture, Afternoon light streamed through the western windows to illuminate the 17 mirrored arches opposite. The room that had witnessed the most glittering celebrations of the Sun King's reign stood empty except for servants who moved quietly, maintaining the surfaces that reflected light with such calculated precision. This room, more than any other, embodied Lewis's vision. Light multiplied endlessly, reflecting back and forth between mirrors and windows, creating an impression of infinite space and infinite grandeur. The hall had been built to overawe visiting dignitaries, to demonstrate French power through sheer architectural magnificence. It had succeeded beyond even its creator's ambitions, becoming perhaps the most famous room in Europe, inspiring imitations in palaces from Madrid to St. Petersburg. Now it waited silently, its mirrors reflecting nothing but empty space and afternoon sun, waiting to learn what role it would play in the reign to come. The gardeners outside continued their endless work, trimming hedges into precise geometric shapes, ensuring that every plant conformed to the overall design. They had been doing this work for decades, some of them following patterns laid down by Lenotre and maintained by his successors. The king's approaching death meant nothing to the gardens, which would continue requiring the same careful maintenance regardless of who sat on the throne. Plants grew according to their own logic, indifferent to human politics, and someone would need to keep trimming them into unnatural shapes, no matter what happened in the palace. By afternoon, the king's breathing had become more laboured, more irregular. The physicians recognized the signs of approaching death, the body systems beginning their final shutdown. They had seen it before in other patients, though never in a king who had reigned for 7 decades. The end was coming within hours now, not days. They conferred in whispers, agreeing that there was nothing more they could do except make the king as comfortable as possible in his final moments. The priests intensified their prayers, their voices rising and falling in ancient Latin phrases that had attended countless deaths over the centuries. The words promised salvation, eternal life, reward for earthly suffering. Whether they brought comfort to the dying king, no one could say. His eyes remained closed now, his consciousness seeming to retreat inward towards some private place, where he faced whatever final reckonings awaited him. The great lords of France had been gathering in the antechambers, each claiming his traditional place in the hierarchy that would witness the king's death. The Duke of Orleans stood closest to the bedchamber door, as befitted his position as the king's nephew and likely regent. The legitimized royal bastards occupied their contested positions, neither fully royal nor fully common, existing in an ambiguous space that the dying king had created for them. The peers of France, those who held the highest titles in the kingdom, arranged themselves according to precedents that had been established over centuries. This gathering represented the cream of French nobility, families whose ancestors had served kings for generations, whose fortunes and power depended entirely on royal favour. They stood in their elaborate court dress, wearing fabrics and jewels that represented staggering wealth, and waited for a king to die so they could begin competing for favour from his successor. The rituals of monarchy continued their ancient dance, following steps that had been established long before any person in that room was born. In the bedchamber itself, space had become increasingly crowded as more people claimed the right to witness the king's death. Cardinals and bishops pressed close, their ecclesiastical authority giving them precedence over secular nobles. The king's personal servants, who had attended him for decades, held their positions near the bed, unwilling to surrender their places to latecomers. The physicians remained at hand, still monitoring vital signs, even though there was nothing left to do. Everyone wanted to say they were there, wanted to claim their place in this historic moment. The king stirred one last time as afternoon faded toward evening. His eyes opened briefly, seeming to focus on something or someone beyond the range of normal vision. His lips moved, forming words that those nearest the bed strained to hear. Some later claimed he had spoken of France, of his hopes for his heir, of his regrets for mistakes made during his long reign. Others insisted he had called out to dead loved ones, to his mother or his first wife, or one of the countless children who had predeceased him. Still others maintained he had simply been delirious. His final words, meaningless syllables with no coherent content. Whatever the truth, the words were his last. His breathing faltered, paused, resumed weakly, then stopped entirely. The physicians moved forward to confirm what everyone in the room already knew. The Sun King, who had ruled France since 1643, who had built Versailles as a monument to absolute monarchy, who had transformed France into the dominant power in Europe, was dead. The date was September 1st, 1715. The time was approximately 8 o'clock in the morning, though different accounts would later disagree about the exact moment. For several seconds, no one moved or spoke. The room hung suspended in a strange moment between reigns, between one reality and another. Then the Duke of Orleans stepped forward and spoke the words that marked the transition. "The king is dead. Long live the king." He turned and walked quickly from the bedchamber toward the apartments of Louis XV, beginning the formal process of transferring power to a child of 5 who would now bear the title and burden of King of France. Behind him, in the chamber he had just left, the machinery of royal death began its elaborate work. The king's body would need to be prepared for burial, a process that would take weeks and involve dozens of servants following protocols that had been established over centuries. His heart would be removed and placed in its own reliquary. His entrails would be separately interred. The embalmed body would lie in state for days, allowing his subjects to pay their final respects. Eventually, he would be buried at the Basilica of Saint-Denis alongside his ancestors, taking his place in the long line of French kings. But before any of that could happen, the palace needed to acknowledge that the center around which it had organized itself for 7 decades was gone. Servants began moving through the corridors, quietly informing everyone they encountered that the king had died. The news spread outward in ripples, reaching the farthest corners of the palace within minutes, then spreading beyond the walls to the town of Versailles, then to Paris, then to the provinces, then to foreign courts across Europe. In the Hall of Mirrors, a servant extinguished the candles that had been burning there, ending their reflected multiplication of light. In the Chapel Royal, the bells began to toll, a slow, solemn cadence that would continue for hours, announcing to the world that France had lost its king. In the gardens, the fountains were shut down, their water stilling to reflect the sudden quiet that had fallen over the palace. Even the orange trees seemed to droop in their boxes, as if nature itself mourned the passing of the man who had bent it so completely to his will. The courtiers who had spent their entire adult lives organizing their existence around the king's schedule found themselves suddenly adrift. There would be no evening assembly, because there was no king to assemble around. There would be no royal supper, because there was no king to eat it. The elaborate rituals that had structured every day for decades had become instantly obsolete, replaced by an uncertain interim period before a new set of rituals could be established around a child king. Madame de Maintenon, hearing the news in her apartments, quietly finished packing the few belongings she would take with her to Saint-Cyr. She had already made her arrangements, had already said her private farewells. Now she would leave Versailles as quickly as propriety allowed, retreating to the obscurity she had once emerged from, leaving behind the power and influence she had wielded for 30 years. Her story was over, a footnote to the reign of a king who had dominated his era so completely that even his widow would be largely forgotten by history. The Duke of Saint-Simon, ever the chronicler, began making notes that he would later expand into the detailed memoirs that would preserve this day for posterity. He recorded who stood where, who wept, and who remained dry-eyed, who rushed to the new king, and who lingered with the dead one. His observations would eventually fill thousands of pages, creating an incomparable record of Versailles at this pivotal moment, preserving details that would otherwise have been lost to time. The young Louis XV, now Louis XV, by the grace of God, King of France and Navarre, sat in his apartment surrounded by adults who were trying to explain what had happened and what it meant for him. The child understood in some vague way that he was now king, that the palace and everyone in it now belonged to him in some abstract sense, but the full implications remained beyond his grasp. He would grow into his role over time, would eventually become a king in his own right, but for now he was simply a frightened child who had lost his great-grandfather and found himself at the centre of a attention he had never sought. The regency would officially begin the next day, with the Duke of Orleans taking control of the government until the young king reached his majority. The Duke had been preparing for this moment for months, gathering supporters, making plans, positioning himself to seize power as smoothly as possible. He was a capable man, intelligent and cultured, though his morals were questionable and his ambitions were entirely for himself rather than for France. He would rule the kingdom for the next 8 years, making decisions in the king's name while the king himself grew from a child into an adolescent. In the stables, the grooms led the king's favourite horses through a final walk, a gesture of respect for the man who had loved these animals. The horses would pass to the new king, who would continue their pampered existence at Versailles, but they would never again carry the man who had selected them, who had ridden them through the forests on countless hunting expeditions, who had preferred their company to that of most courtiers. The stable master, who had served Louis for 40 years, allowed himself a few private tears as he watched the procession of magnificent animals. The Swiss guards who protected the palace maintained their posts despite the chaos and grief swirling around them. They were professionals, soldiers who took their duties seriously, regardless of which Louis sat on the throne. They would serve the new king with the same devotion they had shown the old one, standing at attention through long hours, ready to defend the palace against threats both real and imagined. The crown might pass from one person to another, but their service was to the institution of monarchy itself, which continued regardless of which individual wore the crown. Night fell on Versailles for the first time in 72 years without a king in residence. The palace, built to house and glorify absolute monarchy, stood silent in the darkness. Lights burned in windows where servants worked through the night, preparing for the elaborate funeral ceremonies that would begin the next day. In the chapel, priests continued their prayers for the dead king's soul, their voices rising and falling in ancient rhythms. In the apartments of the new king, his household tried to establish some semblance of routine for a child whose life had just been irrevocably transformed. The gardens, those impossible gardens that had required the labor of thousands of workers over 50 years to create, stood quiet under the September sky. The fountains were still, their water dark and motionless. The precisely trimmed hedges cast sharp shadows in the moonlight. The orange trees lined up in their formations, waiting for morning when they would be moved to different positions according to seasonal schedules laid down years before. Nature, forced into unnatural shapes by human will and human labor, waited patiently for the chance to reclaim what had been taken from it. In Paris, where news of the king's death had arrived via swift riders, the reaction was complex and contradictory. Some genuinely mourned the passing of a king who had ruled for their entire lives, who had become as permanent a feature of French life as the seasons themselves. Others celebrated quietly, seeing in his death the possibility of change, of relief from the heavy taxation that had burdened them for decades. Still others remained carefully neutral, unsure what the future held, but certain that expressing strong opinions in any direction carried risks. The foreign ambassadors who maintained residences near Versailles began composing urgent dispatches to their home governments, reporting the king's death and speculating about what it might mean for the balance of power in Europe. Louis had dominated European politics for so long that his absence would create a vacuum that other powers would rush to fill. The War of the Spanish Succession had ended only 2 years earlier in 1713, leaving Europe exhausted but hardly at peace. Would France under a regency be weaker, more vulnerable to pressure from Austria or England or the Dutch Republic? Back at Versailles, in the now silent Hall of Mirrors, moonlight streamed through the western windows to illuminate the empty room. The mirrors reflected nothing but moonlight and shadows, the space that had been designed to hold hundreds of courtiers now holding only silence and absence. This room, perhaps more than any other, embodied everything Louis had built. Magnificent, expensive, impressive, and ultimately serving no practical purpose except to demonstrate power and wealth. The king had spent approximately 4 billion livres on Versailles over the course of his reign, a sum so vast that it had effectively bankrupted the French treasury. He had diverted rivers to feed his fountains, moved forests to create new sightlines, employed thousands of workers for decades to realize his vision. And for what? To create a palace that served primarily as a stage for elaborate rituals designed to glorify absolute monarchy, to house a court whose main function was to keep the nobility away from their provincial power bases and focused instead on competition for royal favour. The servants who had attended the king's body through the night finally emerged from the bedchamber, exhausted by their sombre duties. They had washed the body, dressed it in royal garments, prepared it for the public viewing that would begin later that day. The man they had served in life, they had now prepared for death, maintaining the same attention to detail, the same devotion to proper form. They moved through darkened corridors toward their quarters, carrying with them memories they would share with grandchildren decades hence. The palace silverware, those thousands of pieces of gold and silver plate that had represented one of the visible symbols of royal wealth, began its transformation from the king's property to the property of his heir. Inventories would need to be taken, accounting made of every fork and spoon and serving dish. The bureaucracy of monarchy continued its meticulous work, tracking assets, recording transfers, maintaining the elaborate systems that kept track of who owned what in this complex household. In the king's private cabinet, his personal papers lay in careful piles, ready to be reviewed by executors who would sort through decades of correspondence, personal notes, and private documents. Among these papers would be found evidence of the human being behind the royal mask, glimpses of Louis's private thoughts and feelings, his doubts and fears and hopes. But these revelations would remain largely private, shared only with a handful of people trusted to manage the king's estate, hidden from the public that knew him only through his carefully cultivated public image. The sun rose on September 2nd, 1715, illuminating a palace in transition. Versailles, which had never known a morning without its Sun King, now faced its first dawn in a new era. The servants who maintained the buildings and grounds began their work as they always did, because palaces require constant care regardless of political circumstances. The gardeners trimmed hedges, the cleaners swept marble floors, the fountains remained silent, but everything else continued much as before. In the Chapel Royal, preparations for the first Requiem Mass proceeded under the direction of the Master of Ceremonies, who consulted thick books of protocol to ensure every detail met the standards appropriate for a royal funeral. The king's death would be marked by weeks of ceremonial observance, each ritual carefully prescribed, each moment choreographed. The church would claim the king's soul, would guide it through whatever awaited beyond death, would ensure that his passing received the full spiritual attention that his rank demanded. The young king was awoken by his governess and dressed in the black mourning clothes that he would wear for the next year. The child submitted to this transformation without fully understanding it, allowing servants to put him into unfamiliar garments, to adjust his posture, to prepare him for public appearances at which he would need to represent the continuity of the monarchy. He was being transformed from a person into a symbol, from a child into an institution, whether he understood it or not. The great machinery of the French state, which had organized itself around one man for 7 decades, now struggled to reorganize itself around a child. Ministers continued their work, maintaining the functions of government, but they looked to the Duke of Orleans for direction, rather than to the throne itself. The separation of power from the person of the king, which Louis had spent his life preventing, now became unavoidable. The regency would be a different kind of government, more dispersed, more vulnerable to faction, less able to maintain the absolute control that had characterized the previous reign. Outside the palace walls, in the forests where Louis had hunted countless times, deer and boar moved through their habitats, unaware that the man who had pursued them for sport was gone. Nature continued its cycles indifferent to human concerns, following patterns that predated the palace and would outlast it. The trees that had been carefully managed to provide good hunting would gradually revert to wilder growth if no one maintained them. The streams that had been channeled to feed fountains would find their natural courses again if human engineering failed. In the town of Versailles, Shops opened and commerce resumed, though draped in black bunting to acknowledge the royal death. Life demanded its continuation regardless of who ruled. Bread needed to be baked and sold. Horses needed to be shod. Children needed to be taught their letters. The daily rhythms of ordinary life went on, touched but not halted by the death of a king who had barely acknowledged the existence of common people except as sources of taxation and occasional public spectacle. The palace, that magnificent monument to one man's vision of absolute monarchy, stood in the September sunlight, looking much as it had the day before, when its creator still lived. The marble gleamed white, the gold decorations caught the light, the windows reflected sky and clouds. But something essential had changed. The soul that had animated this elaborate body was gone, leaving behind an empty shell whose future purpose remained uncertain. Would Versailles remain the centre of French power under the new regime? Or would the court drift back to Paris, where it had been before Louis moved it permanently to this artificial paradise in 1682? Would future kings maintain this expensive establishment, or would they allow it to decline into elegant decay? These questions hung in the air, unanswered and perhaps unanswerable. The night the palace went silent marked more than the death of one king. It marked the end of an era, the conclusion of a reign that had lasted so long that most French people had known no other ruler. It marked the beginning of questions about absolute monarchy itself, doubts that would eventually culminate in revolution 74 years later. It marked a turning point, though no one in that moment could fully understand how significant the turn would prove to be. As the second night fell on Versailles, the palace remained quiet, its usual bustle subdued by mourning and uncertainty. In the bedchamber where Louis had died, candles burned around his prepared body, tended by servants who had maintained their vigil until the public viewing began. In the apartments of Louis XV, the child king slept fitfully, dreaming whatever dreams a 5-year-old might have, when the entire world had suddenly changed around him. And in the gardens, the fountains stayed silent, their water still, waiting for someone to decide whether they would ever run again. The Sun King was dead, his light extinguished after 72 years of reign. The palace he had built, the court he had created, the entire elaborate structure of absolute monarchy he had perfected, now faced an uncertain future. Versailles had gone silent, its voice stilled, its purpose suddenly unclear. The night had fallen, and morning would bring a new world that even the wisest observers could not fully predict. All anyone could say for certain was that nothing would ever be quite the same again.